Well, I guess the most obvious thing that can be said about Michael Cunningham's novel, The Hours, is that it is a novel of three stories instead of one. Um, it is another example of a narrative that is not told in any kind of linear fashion, but goes back and forth in time with characters and events that seem to be, in many ways, disconnected. But at the heart of the novel, um, the core um, plot, I guess, in the story is the story of Virginia Woolf writing Mrs. Dalloway. In that book, um, and she calls it herself, an ordinary woman's whole life in a single day. And this is something that is kind of an imitation of James Joyce's novel Ulysses, where he had a single day in Dublin, and his main character Harold Bloom just an ordinary person. And in many ways, Virginia Woolf, in writing Mrs. Dalloway, was trying to write a book about a woman, first of all, and not this big giant novel like Ulysses, but one that, in a different way, in a more female way, grasped a woman's life, a whole of a woman's life in a way, in a single day. The opening of the book is with Virginia Woolf's suicide. And so it has been coming into my attention that there's a lot of mental illness and war and suffering in some of the books that we've been reading, and I think we could all be done with that pretty soon. But anyway, just to give a little bit of Woolf's history here. The time of the writing of the novel is 1923, and it is she had been a published writer already, but she is now at this time under a doctor's care. She is living in the suburbs of London in a place called Richmond, which really is part of now at least it's part of the larger London metropolitan area, I think. But it is more of a quiet suburb, especially back in 1923. But Woolf, one of the things about her life is that she really loved London, and she wanted to write a novel that was about London and London life. And she was being kept from going there during this time period, and so she really missed it. And by the end of the novel, or near the end of the novel, she does finally persuade her husband to forget about the doctor's orders and move them back to London. And that she says she'd rather be there and lose her mind than to be stuck in the suburbs. So Woolf is supposed to be resting. She's supposed to not let things excite her, and that's why she's not in London. Some of the symptoms, I think it's kind of interesting that the symptoms that she suffered are ones that Septimus, one of the characters in the novel, suffers as well, but also a couple of the characters in The Hours. Richard, for example, like Virginia Woolf, he hears voices, he sees hallucinations, and some of the things he hears are like animals, people speaking in what sounds like Greek. And so these are things that all have happened to Virginia Woolf. And one other thing I would say by way of introduction here is that originally, when she started writing this story, her title for it was The Hours, not Mrs. Dalloway. And in that original plan, she did intend for Mrs. Dalloway to commit suicide. And at one point, and this is something that's discussed in the novel, in The Hours, but at one point she changes her mind, and makes her live. And Clarissa Dalloway is someone who loves life, but doesn't like the challenges of living in such confined circumstances. So I think the greatest challenge of studying the hours is doing it without having read Mrs. Dalloway first. Um, the questions of the novel being perhaps being derivative of Mrs. Dalloway or standing on its own is a question that the last time when I taught both of these novels in the same semester was a question that we talked about a lot. You know, if you can't appreciate the hours without having first read Mrs. Dalloway, then maybe it's not good enough to stand on its own. But my students in that course really felt that they really appreciated the hours, and I think that all of them agreed that this novel is one that can stand by itself. But I do think I'm going to want to provide some information so that you can see that there are really interesting parallels between the two novels. So if we look at some of the elements of the plot and the characters and some of the relationships between these characters, we can begin to see some of the parallels between this novel and the hours. And one of the really interesting things is the parallels are often inverted or slightly skewed in a way that, I hope that I can make apparent as we go along. So in Mrs. Dalloway, there are two different plot lines with protagonists that will never meet, Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Ward Smith. One is a man and one is a woman, yet what Woolf does is employ Septimus as an alter ego to Clarissa. And that might seem kind of odd because one's a man, one's a woman. They never meet. They wind up kind of walking or passing each other in London several times, and crisscrossing paths and such, and with other characters as well. Both have been damaged by war. Septimus is suffering from shell shock or PTSD. He was a soldier in the war. He saw his friend killed in war right in front of him, and he's really not doing very well. Clarissa has had heart problems, and it's not necessarily directly caused by the war, but during the World War I period, a lot of people who were not at war lost family members, and everybody knew people who had lost loved ones in the war, and it's kind of implied that her heart condition may have been brought on by the stress of the time. I mentioned Woolf's original intention that Clarissa was the one who was going to die in the end, to commit suicide, but at some point she felt like, no, this character would choose life over that. And I think that she created the alter ego pretty much as a way to balance it out. She says in the hours, her character says that someone else had to die, so for the contrast, so that we could feel the joy of choosing life more so. It's kind of an ironic idea, but that's the general gist. So Clarissa is married to Richard Dalloway, and they're happily married. They've been married for quite some time. But a lot of the story is Clarissa reflecting back when they were all young, and she had a youthful secret passion for Sally Seton, which is this is an early novel in the early 20th century for people to be talking frankly about lesbian or other homosexual relationships, but it's all kind of veiled. But Sally Seton at one point kisses Clarissa on the lips, and in a very passionate way. And this is one of the biggest things that Clarissa remembers in her whole life. So and she goes on to marry Richard, but this is the thing that she kind of holds on to, and she kind of discusses within the context of the novel how she can't feel passion the way that does, or that Peter Walsh, will talk about him in a minute too. If she reflects on, if there was a moment of love, it was this moment that she remembers when she was kissed by Sally Seton. Also, in that early period of life, she was being pursued by Peter Walsh. Not pursued. I mean, she was being courted by Peter Walsh. Peter was, very much in love with her and wanted to marry her, but Clarissa eventually refuses him, and it's partly because Peter is too intense. He's too caught up in his things he's passionate about, and she's kind of intimidated by his um, kind of very overt sexuality and passion. Richard Dalloway is a very safe bet. He becomes a member of Parliament, so that's an important thing. And he becomes something of a failure. He gets in trouble in the university. He goes to India where he is working. He marries a woman on the boat going over there. That marriage fails. He's currently in love with somebody else, and now when he's 50 years old. So anyway, he's something of a failure, but he comes back into the novel as a character with Clarissa and Richard and everybody else. In this slide, I would like to draw your attention to these names then. And as if you've been reading the hours, you might see, oh, there are some names here that we have in common. So hold on to the idea of these names that are in common until we get to the next slide. Before we do that, though, I would just want to mention here about Septimus, is that Ratia is his wife. She's Italian. Septimus was stationed in Italy at the end of the war, World War One, where he was still kind of in shock and was not exhibiting the symptoms that we were talking about before. But he gets worse and worse, and so Ratia is his wife, who has to endure his having him in public when he's acting really nuts. Okay, well, here's where things get interesting. Okay, so you notice that in the hours now, in this side, again, we have a single day of Clarissa's life as she prepares to give a party. And this time the party is for Richard, okay? But so these two things are really quite the same. But Richard, this time, is not her husband, but her partner is Sally. And so you have, instead of a traditional heterosexual marriage, you have a lesbian relationship. And Richard is the youthful passion that she had, and they're the ones who share a kiss that is, for Clarissa Vaughan, the most memorable thing of her life. That the author is wanting us to be thinking about Mrs. Dalloway when we are reading the hours is very clear, I think, because Richard, in his relationship with Clarissa Vaughan, calls her Mrs. Dalloway as a nickname. In both stories, each couple, Dalloways and Clarissa and Sally, Clarissa has a daughter, and so Elizabeth Dalloway is the daughter of Clarissa and Richard, and then Julia is the daughter of Clarissa and Sally. In this case, the names are different, but there's still that parallel. Now, there is also a Peter Walsh type character in the hours, and that would be Lewis Waters. And again, there's a parallel, but it's kind of twisted or skewed. Um, Lewis is, so here in Mrs. Dalloway, Peter Walsh was the one who loved Clarissa in their youth. In the hours, Lewis and Richard have this youthful, intense relationship that goes bad at some point, and so Lewis leaves Richard, and it becomes a big point of contention. But Lewis, like Peter Walsh, is impulsive, is kind of not in control of his sexuality. I mentioned with Peter Walsh that he had failed marriages. He was in love now, even at 50, with a woman who was only like 23 or something. Lewis, when we see him in the novel, tells Clarissa that he too is now in love. He's a college theater professor, and he is in a relationship with one of his students. So it's a very similar kind of person who's kind of governed by his sexual nature. The Laura Brown plot line in the hours is parallel then to the Septimus Warren Smith plot line in Mrs. Dalloway. So Dan Brown, who was Laura's husband, as we know, it was a soldier in World War II, but he came back just fine. He was not damaged by the war. But in this case, it's the wife who is damaged, not so much by war, but she suffers from depression. So we have a parallel situation, but one that is again inverted or skewed. Laura has the two of them together have a child, one child, Richie, and she is now pregnant again. And so I had the impression, I've had the assumption that what she suffers from is a kind of a postpartum depression. And then for those of you who know my wife, Dr. Coogan, I just decided to ask her about that, and I said, "Is that what you think it is?" And she said, "No, she thinks what she suffers from is from terminal patriarchy," and which I thought was an interesting comment. And I think that in particular about this situation, there is a youthful lesbian kiss in this novel, in this plot line too, between between Laura Brown and Kitty, her neighbor. And the kiss, I don't know if you've ever seen the film, but the moment when they kiss is clearly, homoerotic, and Laura is afraid that Kitty's going to reject her for doing such a thing, but that doesn't really happen. So I don't know, I think that the issue of women being oppressed by what critics sometimes call compulsory heterosexuality could be part of Laura's depression. So I don't know if it's postpartum depression for sure, but it could be a number of things. But she is definitely depressed. And as the parallel develops in the hours, the question arises, and I don't know how far you've gotten in the novel so far, but will Laura Brown, like Septimus Warren Smith, take her life? It becomes an issue that she's severely depressed, and in the novel it does seem to be leading that direction. But we'll see what happens when we get there. Right, so these two plot lines take place in two different time periods. 1949 for Laura Brown, and I think it's like the late 90s. I don't know if they ever give a date for the later time frame, but I think it's late. The novel was published in 98, so I'm assuming it was written for around that time. So what is it that ties them together? Well, I'm gonna, if you haven't gotten this far in the novel yet, it's not until later on in the novel that this becomes quite apparent, but what ties them together, and it's something of a spoiler, I guess, but it's Richie. Richie Brown, who is the daughter of Laura and Dan Brown, is the same Richard that later on goes to meet Clarissa, and he has that memorable kiss with her, and he also goes on to have a relationship with Lewis. So these two plot lines combined with the core one, Virginia Woolf in 1923 writing the story that eventually became Mrs. Dalloway, to provide a very rich experience of connections and parallels in what I think is a very impressive postmodern performance.